So the parable of the 10 minas is an interesting one for me as I was reading that. I think there's a lot of different things that come through that, but what stood out to you guys?
One of the things that they just kept bouncing back to me, I mean, in the whole theme of time sensitivity, and we're talking about the Great Commission and, the mission that we as all Christians are on. But you pointed out something, and the reason that the entire parable was said was, the prophecy, the prophetic, about the king's servants turning against him. It talked a lot about the Jewish expectation of what the Messiah would be, and that the Jews missed the Messiah because the Messiah didn't meet their expectations. And it was one of the earlier points that you made, but it just kind of jumped out at me as how much do we as a church miss what God is currently doing because we're expecting him to do something that he did 10 years ago, or we're expecting him to do something that he did even yesterday. But because of our lack of imagination and our lack of ability to deviate from our own expectations, we miss the joys and the grandeur of what God is doing in the moment.
Absolutely.
Don't you call me out like that.
Calling myself out like that.
I think that's really, really profound. I like especially the things that he did 10 years ago or yesterday. There are parts and pieces to all of our lives that we are trying to move forward, trying to strive, trying to better ourselves and better who we can be, that we always have this roadmap laid out.
Biggest mistake we've ever made.
Oh. Yeah, the roadmap leading us to our career that we want, or the way that we think that we can help people. Me learning how to play drums again because we need a drummer when Cora is off at school.
Decided to go to college.
How dare she?
In the concept of self-betterment, but
but all of those things that we try to do and expect God to help us do are maybe not always the things that are what we are supposed to be doing. And you can take my singing as the example of that.
yes,
Yeah, that is not what I'm supposed to do.
we know.
Jesus save us.
I'm so glad you said that. I thought you were going to go the exact opposite and be like, maybe God is going to, call me in to sing it. No, he's not.
No,
God,
no,
God,
pretty sure.
God may be big.
That's a miracle verging on healing. I'm not really sure where that goes.
But it's the idea that we can plan for these things and ask for these things, but it may not necessarily be what we need, and that imagination or lack thereof is a crutch for us, and it becomes a deficit in who we are to become.
The sermon didn't go in this direction, but I think we definitely have a small view of God's imagination. I think that when I was growing up in church all the time, there was the talk of God's perfect will versus God's permissive will, and all of the stuff that went along with that, and trying to figure that out. So you're like always trying to what's God's perfect will for me? I don't want to do the permissive will, which isn't even how those scriptures
I'm called
are
to be a
really
missionary to
supposed
China.
Yeah, that's not really how those scriptures are meant to be read. But you spend so much time getting bogged down in that. I think that there's a lot of times that when we're walking in our life and when we're walking and we're seeking God and we decide to choose option A, I just think that God's imagination sees oh my goodness, look at how many things that you can do for the kingdom walking down that path. Or if we choose option B, it's the same response. Look at how many things you can do for the kingdom walking down that path. I think sometimes we just like, we want, and maybe that's a kind of pride, and maybe that's a kind of idolization of our own lives, where we think that we need to hear from God some kind of specific thing. Like, if God wants us to do this, then we need to hear some kind of specific thing. But God's going, you know what? I gave you a zillion opportunities. Choose one. You know? Like, and so I think sometimes we can really get paralyzed by that, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of times we forget that God gave us free will and gave us desire. You know, and the way he created us, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to, okay, did I audibly hear from God on this point? Or, you know, is God, you know, leading me this direction, or do I just want to go this direction? God gave us free will, and God gave us desires, and we are his creation. He created us to be, you know, a certain thing, to be a certain type of person. And our natural inclinations are going to frequently line up with God's will, so long as we are walking in that path with God as part of our lives. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
to kind of tie that back to the parable a bit more directly, the parable speaks of 3 of the 10 servants that had received mina, one of which invested really good. I'd like to invest like that. Another one who also had gains in his investment, and he put that money to work, maybe less efficiently, but he still put it to work. And then the last that they mention just hid the money under a mattress and tried not to lose it. And I think that there is a very delicate balance. And what are the words I used? That there is a very delicate balance between risk and stewardship. The first guy that the first servant that had the 10 minas in return, he could have lost it all, but he actively made choices to make it produce more. It would be the same as, say, a farmer buying seeds to plant into the ground to get corn. You can buy as many seeds as you like, but there may be some years that the corn just doesn't grow. That is a loss, but at least there was a work and there was a push to be a good steward to the seeds that you do have, to try to help them bear more fruit. And I think
If we bring that back to what they're really talking about here, though, is the gospel. So when Jesus is gone, what people are going to do with the message, which is the minas, really, you know. And so if we take it a little bit out of the monetary and put it back into the gospel, because the gospel will never return void. So that's something to consider too, because as you were talking, I was like, gee, I wonder what Jesus's response would have been if somebody would have said, I tried my best, but I lost it. The seeds didn't grow.
yeah.
But we know that the word of God doesn't return void. And so I think that was kind of a distraction for me for a minute, because I think that when whatever we do with the gospel,
It will bear fruit
it
in
will
some
bear
capacity.
fruit. Yeah, exactly.
So
I
long as
think-
we maintain the gospel.
Yes.
I think bouncing back to the approach you were taking, looking at it in a monetary sort of fashion.
Well, even outside of monetary, even our breath.
Yep.
I have so many breaths.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the monetary fashion, though. How often does our fear hold us back from truly accomplishing what we're capable of accomplishing? you look at the third servant, he said, I know you were, how did he phrase it?
Is it a hard
A hard master,
Yeah.
taking what you didn't earn, reaping what you didn't sow, something like that.
But
That fear is what held him back.
But the interesting thing is he wasn't afraid of the master.
Oh,
He was afraid
I know
that
there's so much more to go into
yeah,
with that.
he was afraid that the master would remunerate him for his efforts.
Mm-hmm.
So it was still selfish, which then begs the next question, is fear selfish?
The argument could be made.
I think it could. I mean, unless you're talking about somebody just jumping out at you, like
Yeah.
out of a closet.
Scared of that dark
scared
alley.
you. Yeah, I mean, there's also just a reaction too. But you could say it's a reaction of self-preservation. So kind
There's
of fits.
selfishness there.
Yeah, so it's there. So that really kind of deserves, but he uses fear as an excuse, but what that excuse really is he wasn't afraid for his safety or afraid for his livelihood. He was afraid that he wouldn't be paid back because he didn't trust the master.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because as I was reading that, I'm like, wow, talk about saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, right. Well, that's when I first read it. I'm like, that's bold.
Yeah.
You're I'm sorry, master.
know you're
you are
really
a
mean.
You are a hard man. Then why would you say that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, but and
So the last guy wasn't real smart, maybe, but
Hence the mattress.
on the concept of self-preservation
yeah.
wasn't there, oddly. But you also bouncing all the way back, to the idea of imagination and fear, and with what you just said, with the servant wasn't afraid of the master. The servant was afraid he wasn't going to get what he deserved.
Yes.
How often do we as the church, and don't quote me on this, I'm more asking questions here, so nobody
means it's
take
dangerous.
this to the bank. Churches all have a tendency of operating independently and failing to operate and function and work together for the greater picture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's something that churches as a whole could probably glean from this a little bit, of the recognize the greater picture? And it's not about your church or your church or your church being recognized when we get to heaven for doing, what they were supposed to, but rather the church as a whole being recognized. It's kind of a scary concept.
Well, you just opened up the door to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Revolution.
I wasn't the first one.
Yeah. Standing on the shoulders of some pretty big guys.
Yeah.
I think that it is definitely. Okay, so this is maybe we're all going to step in a little bit of it today, but there's
I have to wash my shoes off
Yeah.
later.
We
but
haven't already.
I think that with the church growth movement, when everybody's trying to be like the next mega church, or everybody started in the church world started defining success based on how many people were in their pews and how many fancy programs they could do and all of this and all of that. And we accepted success by the world standards. We talk all the time about allowing the outside culture into the church. If you want to look at how we define success, I don't think that there is a greater example of the outside culture entering the church. And so when you talk about that, and then bring in those ideas, like, are we each actually thinking about the kingdom, or are we each kind of trying to build our own little kingdoms? Yeah, we've been doing that for a long, long time. And that's a focus here. That's one of the focuses here, is that we are kingdom minded. If we're a congregation of just a few people, but we are a congregation of a few people that can affect this city and can affect this area, then we're doing what we need to do. We don't need to build our own little kingdom here. And that's something that's really interesting. And then when you start looking at the 10 minas, and I bring this up in the sermon, is Jesus never like says, you get a mina, you get a mina. He doesn't dole them out.
Thank you, Oprah.
For some reason, they each have a mina, right? And so it begs the question, and this is I mean, extra biblical, I guess, but because it's really not brought up here. But it begs the question of why didn't they keep the minas pooled, and the one who had the talent to make it 10 times work with the one who was just working out of fear and hid it, because they could have had a much greater return if they worked together.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times in the church, we miss out on that. We think, oh, well, we did our, we multiplied. But what could we have done if we actually, as the body of Christ, worked together to do that with our strengths? We could be way more effective.
Well, going back to what you were saying with the worldly standards, of, growth and success, I don't know that there's any way to run anything, I guess, with that philosophy without a large element of pride and competition.
Yeah.
In going back to, the servants, maybe they didn't work together because they felt like they were in competition with each other. Because in the end, they're going to get compared, and held up to the standard of the person that's standing next to them, rather than the overall success, because all they can see is from their perspective. But
Yeah.
it's a dangerous place for a church to end up.
Yeah.
I mean, the thought of a mega church, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that clicked something just now.
Like broke clicked, or
We'll see.
We'll wait to
let,
see
let
what
me
he says.
let me get through the thought, and you tell me. Jesus replied, "I tell you," I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they will have will be taken away. If we are faithful in our church of 5 people, 10 people, 3,000, 2,700 people,
whatever you
it
have.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter. If you have a faithful church, a successful church by God's standards, more will be given, more influence, perhaps more. Not
More-
I want to hesitate with that
I think
word,
the better word would be responsibility.
but more responsibility, more responsibility will be given. You can take 10 people and you can pastor 10 people way further than you can pastor 10,000 people on your own. Because once you're at the level of pastoring 10,000 people, that's too much for you to handle by yourself usually.
Well,
And
if you
Just
get a
look at
church that
pastoral
size-
care. There's no way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you get a church that size, though, if they're a good leader, then they have the teams underneath them and the
And
ministry
more
staff
will be
and
given.
more pastors and stuff like that.
But
So in my
that's-
last job, when I was a staff pastor, the lead pastor said something that I think it makes a lot of sense, and that's God's not going to send us people unless we can take care of them. And God might send people, but they are not going to stay, especially, but we're only going to get the number of people that we can take care of. And so I think that that's one of the main things is how well do you take care of your people?
Yes.
And that might be you take care of them with a whole huge staff and you're a mega church, and that's great. It might be one pastor who's working and doing all of the hospital calls, and that's great. I think it's a matter of how you're stewarding what is in front of you, and how you're, serving them.
You work with the church that you're given, not
Yep.
the church you want to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, to go all the way back to where we're at, though, one of the quotes that you put is, "The church explodes when the church understands that time is short." And I think part of what we need to do in our recognition that time is short is stop bickering and fighting amongst ourselves and maybe start functioning as a team cohesively in the way that Christ, called us, to actually function. Because another quote that you had was, "We have the capacity to walk in power. We choose not to."
Yeah.
Which, yeah, that one made me ponder for a little while. But
That one hurt.
yeah, that was personal. But
Sorry.
but I guess it just kind of serves as a call to the churches of, hey, time is short. Let's get it together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the things the points that I brought up in the sermon. When the Acts 2 church exploded, they thought Jesus' return was imminent. When we look at, because we're a Pentecostal denomination, when we look at our history coming out of Azusa Street in California, that exploded because people thought Jesus' return was imminent. And that is responsible for a global missions movement that is so powerful that they're now sending missionaries to us because
For good reason.
yeah, we kind of messed it up. But when people get onto that, when people grasp onto that, we don't have a lot of time. And I mean, even if we're just talking about the time of our lifespan, it's not a lot of time. And if we just grasp onto that, we can get a lot more accomplished, and we will get a lot more accomplished. Think about the person who only has a few weeks to live. What are they doing? They're calling every relative. They're calling every friend they've ever had, and they're ministering to them because they know they don't have a lot of time. If we all lived our lives like that, the church would be unstoppable.
I was gonna.
Now
I
I'm questioning
was-
how much time of my life have I wasted.
I'm going to be honest. When you asked that question, my first thought was they try skydiving for the first time. But I
Okay.
like your answer better.
That too, maybe.
But the point is that bucket list becomes a little more pressing.
Yes.
So I guess
Yes.
ultimately it depends on what's your priority and what's your bucket list.
Yeah, what's your priority?
Skydiving.
Not
apparently.
skydiving.
He's afraid of heights.
Skydiving.
Yes. We'll go with.
Oh, is that so?
Yes.
I'll push you out of the plane.
Yeah.
They won't let me jump, but I'll push you.
They won't let you jump.
No, I'm too heavy. Apparently there's a weight limit for that.
Oh.
So yeah, I'd have to drop.
I don't like that at all.
Why you can't go bungee dropping? Because you have to be honest about your weight.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll give you too long of a cord.
Yeah, I mean, I just look at it and I'm like, for crying out loud, you can drop a Humvee out of the back of a plane. I think I'm okay, but whatever.
They just don't want to touch one of those giant.
How humiliating would that be? Just
Everybody-
little one,
Everybody
little-
jumps out and just parachute.
It's John
there
or
he is.
UFO, one or the other.
It was
Is
a
that
weather
the
balloon.
capsule coming back from space?
Oh, that derailed quick.
Okay.
Trains.
Trains.
All right. I think we're done with